Paul Rubens Artist Watercolour Set, the YouLan series, 5th generation. Let's give these a try today whilst I'm painting a stunning bullfinch. So let's get the brushes wet and let's get started. Now before we get into the main products itself, what we're going to do is get the outline drawing onto the paper for this bullfinch. All I'm using here is a little bit of transfer paper, so graphite backed paper. And all I need to use then is a mechanical pencil. This one is a Faber-Castell one. And it's got a 0.5 nib, and remember it's a 2H lead as well. Then use the medium pressure to kind of apply that to the paper to transfer the image through it as well. Now the paints I'm using, as mentioned, are Paul Rubens, and it's their 5th generation, the YouLan series, so I've never tried them before. And they've also provided the paper as well, which is very kind of them. They've also provided a very large brush, which I've only used for doing the colour swatches on the testing sheet here. Now let's go for the orange first of all, one of the many colours that we can see within that mixing palette. Now this one is called Chromium Orange Hue. Okay, alright, never had that one before. And also I'm going to go for the next one, which is going to be the Cadmium Red Light. Now using a size 6 brush, I want to wet the paper first of all. And I'm just doing it very carefully, probably a couple of times as well, trying to make sure I stay within those lines. Have you noticed with this tin, it's got a little thumb holder on the back, so when you open the palette up, it'll be handy for plein air painting. In other words, painting outdoors, okay? And apparently these paints are highly pigmented. Apparently they should last a long time, and also permanent. But I'll tell you what we'll do later on, we'll try that out on some scrap watercolour paper, or even another sheet of the same paper, and see once the paint's dry, whether we can remove that paint or not. That's a good tester, isn't it? We'll try that later on. And they also claim that there's a lot of pigment in these paints. What about some indigo? Indigo, that's a colour I know really well. We'll try that one. So I'll pop it in the mixing well. Now these are metal wells. I'm used to ceramic wells, but we'll give it a try. Now once you've dried that painting, give the head a bit of a wet down. Not soak it through, no, not like that. Then get your indigo and start popping that in its place. Spread it around as well. Now you probably notice as well, when you look at that photograph, you'll see that the top of the head is a little bit lighter, isn't it? So because of that, we can ease off the colour a little bit the higher up we go. Now to remove these paints from the tin, it's very easy. All you've got to do is push one end of it, and it pushes that metal clip in at the top, so you can just release that half pan of paint. Because all of these paints are covered in paper at the moment, so I've got to take off the wrapping first of all. Yes, it looks smart in the tin with the wrappers on, and it also tells you the information for that particular colour on that piece of paper as well. I'm just using my fine detail brush now, my size 00. What I want to do is go over those pencil marks, just preserve those lines a little bit more, and then I can make a start on painting that beak. Once I've just defined some of the lines within inside that beak, not the outside edge of the beak though, you don't want to outline around that. All I need to do is dampen that beak, and then I can start to add in a little bit of colour in there. So dampen it down very lightly, go for the indigo, and then drop that onto that beak. But you notice the top part of the beak, or the upper mandible, is brighter or lighter the higher up it goes. So make sure that you have the colour to the lower part of that top part of the beak. You know what I mean anyway. Okay, then we can start on the eye. Again, using a fine detail brush. This is yet another one I've got. It's another size 00. Then work with inside the eye, trying to consider the overall shape inside the eye. So what I want to do is just make sure that I've got the main shape for the eye spot on before I start to fill it in. So a little note there. Always ensure the shape is about right, the angle of the eye as well. And notice this eye isn't round, is it? It's like an oval, really. And using a barely loaded brush, so hardly any paint on that brush at all, just the very tip. Then you can start to work around the eye and then fill it in. Only so far though, because remember we've got a reflection in there, haven't we? Now, as with all watercolours, we like to start off light and gradually work our way to the darker tones. And that's the way I'm working on this bullfinch at the moment. Just making sure I'm not going too dark too soon, you know. Now I'm showing one of the half pans here from this set. Now, unusually, for me, when you take a wrapper off a half pan, normally you got a print on the side of it, don't you, with a name or whatever on the side. None of these have any names printed on them. So if you do take them out of your tin, then you won't know the name of the colour. So if you mix them up with your other colours such as Winsor & Newton, De La Rowney, Senalia, Daniel Smith's and so on, then you won't know which brand it is. So if you do buy this set, always write on the side of those half pans with a permanent marker pen, just to make sure that if you take them out of that tin in the future, you know which colour it is. Yeah, I know. We all know that some colours can look very similar sometimes, can't they? Yeah. Mind you, they have got a range of 48 different colours here, but I've only got a tin of 24 though. Then I can start on the eye again. Now I want to darken the eye down a little bit more, and by doing so I can start to get more of a shape within the eye, more of a life within the eye. Think about the reflection when you do so as well. Then I can start to add in the details around the top of the head. But I'm looking at the length of the lines and looking at the direction of those lines as well. And also the thickness of the lines. So don't overload that brush when you're doing something like this, because if you do, your lines will be far too thick. Then in between that, you can lightly soften it down as well, just by using a size 6 brush or anything larger, anything like that will be fine. But only a clean, damp brush, and I can lightly soften it down by barely touching the surface of the paper. And in turn, that just knocks it back a little bit as well, just in case you want to add a little bit more paint over the top, and helps it blend together a little bit more. Do the same with the beak as well, so increase the colours within the beak. Look carefully, as mentioned, at that reference photograph. It's so important. So back to my tester strips. Now we know we've got this indigo colour. I'm going to mix it with a little bit more blue as well. I'm trying to think about the colour for the back. And this area is really pale, isn't it? So it's nearly grey. So because of that, I want to make sure I've got some very fine lines on there. And to do that again, like I said earlier, just very lightly load that brush up with paint. And sometimes all I ever do is load the tip of the brush up and that's it. Not the whole body of the brush. But what you can do is load it in your mixing well, give it a roll out the side of the mixing well as you pull away, then tap it once or twice on some paper towel before you go to your painting. Again, just to make sure that those lines are nice and fine. And you obviously need a decent fine tip brush as well, of course, to be able to do this with. Work your way down the back of the wing, look in the direction of those lines again. And you notice that some of these lines tend to vary direction as well. Let's darken this down a little bit more with a colour I've never used before called dioxazine violet. Dioxazine violet, I know, different. We'll mix that with our blue so we get something like that. Then we start to add that in as well. I want to vary the colours within the back and within the wing. Then very lightly soften that down. And once that's dry, you can start to add more details over the top with a much more deeper, richer colour. But as per usual, I'm being very careful where I place these marks. I'm thinking about the roundness to each individual feather as well. I don't want them looking too flat. So think about each individual section. Look at where it's lighter, look at where it's darker. Think about the light, mid-tones and dark tones within each individual feather that you paint. And these are just those main feathers that we can see within that reference photograph. I want to add a bit more orange to the chest now. Think about the shadow that goes underneath that side of the wing. Because otherwise it looks like it's just simply joined to the body. We know it's not. We know that's loose away from the body, isn't it? So we've got to create a bit of a shadow to begin with. And then we can start to think about the colours for that lovely orange chest. Oh yeah. And for that, I'm going to go for the same two colour mixes again, which are the chromium orange hue and also the cad red light. Now, if you haven't got these colours, and I know a lot of people probably won't have, then what you can do is refer to my colour testing video, okay? This is a way that I tend to use, trying to compare my colours that I've got to another artist's tutorial when they're using a different make of paints. So I'll pop that link up on the screen now for you. Okay, here we go. Let's give this one a try, shall we? Not too thick, so more of a watery consistency to begin with. And when I start applying this, I'm just using the very tip of the brush again. Try not to overload it. Keep it nice and pale, nice and light as you do this. Look in the direction the feathers grow, okay? That's so important. Because when you get it in the right direction, you create much more of a shape to the body as well. And when you really look, and I mean really look, at that reference photograph, and zoom into that photograph as well, make sure it's a big photograph, okay? Then you can see the direction the feathers grow. At least then you can replicate all of that onto your watercolour painting. And in turn, you get much more shape to the body. But it also depends on the opacity of the paint as well. So keep it pale for those lighter areas, then increase the pigmentation within that paint. In other words, less water and more paint, of course. And they'll give you much richer and deeper tones as well. Paul Rubens also provided a colour swatch sheet as well. But do note that on that swatch sheet, I can't say swatch today, you find it's all in Chinese. So when I looked at that, I thought, so which colour's that one then? They are in the same order as the paints in the tin, so that's one thing anyway. And also, when you look at the paper version you take off your paints, you see there's a name on there, as well as a paint code number as well, which corresponds to the paint code number on that colour swatch sheet. So you know exactly where to put those colours. The same will apply to the legs and the feet. And all I'm doing is just adding a little bit of paint on there first of all, just to define the outside edges, just to work out where all the little parts go. So where each toe goes, where each claw goes, and also there's very tiny sections we can see within each individual toe. There's quite a few sections there, isn't there? So define those feet, work out where things go before you start filling it in with paint. Then obviously do the same on the other leg and foot as well. Same process. Then you can gradually build those details up on those legs and feet, trying to make them a little bit more 3D. Think about where the shadows go. And the shadows are going to be more or less on the underside of the toes, aren't they? Or the left-hand side of the toes looking at it. So that's where I'm adding the shadows on these anyway. Now let's think about the body again by making a much richer red. And this is where we start to define the shape even more. So right underneath that wing, again, think about the shadow underneath there. It's not a grey shadow, is it? Of course not. The shadow is just a deeper red tone. Then I can add this richer red into the body as well to make it really stand out. Then give it a light soften with your size 6 brush. Now white paint. I know that this is one of those things that everybody likes to use, but I've used it for many, many years. As long as you've got a white paint which is opaque, which is water-based, not acrylic though, because that's too permanent. So you want something that you can take off if you need to. And there's a variety of white paints on the market for watercolours, there really is. So have a look around, see what you can find. This particular one is by SAA. They've changed the properties a little bit apparently, but I've not tried their new version as yet, so I can't guarantee that. And you can also use white gouache as well if you wanted to. And this is to bring out some of those highlights within the body. And also if you wanted to like put a highlight in the eye or on the top of the beak, anything like that. But always think less is best in this case, okay? So don't overdo it with the whites if you can help it. Depends on the subject, I know. If you're painting a white dog, for example, yeah, it can be handy using white. Yeah, of course it can. But in this case, all I want to do is just put a few little white marks here and there. So the highlight for the eye, then all these white areas we can see within the body of the bird as well. Now I've noticed that the angle for the grey part of the wing, the top part of the wing, is not quite right. Mine is more or less like a 12 o'clock direction. It needs to go more towards probably 5 o'clock direction, doesn't it? For that sort of angle down. So I've increased the white in that area, and if I wanted to, I can add a little bit of colour over the top of that white as well to tone that back down later on, if I need to. We'll see how it dries. Because if you have a white paint, it very often dries out a little bit paler, depending on how thick that white paint is. Once you've got the highlights on, then we can make a start on that lovely branch. Now this branch, just going to be a horizontal one, nothing special. On the photograph it's got lichen. I'm not going to add that one in because I want to make it a little bit easier for everybody to do, including myself in this case. So it's going to be a straightforward wooden branch. And the good thing about painting wood, you know, is that you can change it to whatever you want it to be. You can even put it on a different tree if you wanted to, I know. Whatever you want to do. Change the colour, change the texture. Have it really rough. Have some bark falling off it or anything like that. There's so many choices out there to work with. There really is. So do what you want to do when you're painting the branch. Obviously the bird has to be as precise as possible, of course. So working wet and wet first of all, dropping a few odd colours in there. Anything will do, doesn't really matter. And keep it wet and wet to begin with. And then when it's nearly dry, not quite, then I'm going to make up a dark colour. That's going to be a bit of a browny black. So a bit of burnt sienna and ivory black, something like that will be fine. Not too thick, more of a milky consistency, not creamy or anything like that. Then load that size 00 brush back up again. Then you can start putting some horizontal lines in. Why horizontal? Well, you find very often when you're looking at a branch, if the branch is horizontal, very often, majority, not all, the majority of the lines also tend to be quite horizontal. I know it depends on the species of tree, of course it does. But you find this works really, really well. So get those lightest tones in first of all on this damp, not dry, damp paper. Then you can start to add some basic details behind the scenes. Give it a dry and then you can start adding the darker tones on there as well. This is more like a mid-tone really. And because we've got the bluey texture in the background, you find that this starts to look a little bit more 3D. Work on those horizontal marks. Vary the thickness of the lines. Also bring a few little lines down as well. Slight angles so it's not too perfect, not too neat. Even use a dry brush technique over the top to get more of a rough effect. And then use that darkest mix. You can start to add in those really dark recesses within the bark. And this is where the shape will really come together. Now my members on my Patreon site very often say to me, Paul, we have to go through the ugly stage. Well, you do. The ugly stage is when you've got your light tones and your mid-tones on, but not those darkest tones, which I'm doing now. Once you get those darkest tones on, then the painting comes together a bit more. Because it starts to create shape, doesn't it? Notice with this wood is that it's darker on the underside, gradually gets lighter as it goes towards the top of that branch. And then we can even add a little bit of watercolour white over the top of that as well. To add a bit more of a sparkle to that branch. Sparkle on sparkly paper? Yeah, why not? And that in turn again gives much more shape to that branch. It's just taking your time, working out where things go, playing with the textures, and if you add too much white on there, well, go over it again with another colour. Doesn't matter? Of course not. You can even lift it off as well. Let's add a little bit of green in there as well. So olive green dark and burnt sienna, just so I can add some more colour within it as well. Now define those claws, work out where they are for one, and also ensure you've got a shadow underneath those feet, just to anchor that bird to that branch. Now I want to test out the lifting off properties for these colours. Now this is on a strip of Bockingford paper, which is actually my favourite watercolour surface, believe it or not. It's not cotton or anything like that. It's more of a chemical pulp paper, which I've used for many, many years. And I absolutely love it, I really do. And you can see this paint does lift off on my Bockingford strip. So the lifting off properties looks okay so far with something like this. But that's on my own personal paper. So what will it be like on their own paper? Now, you can only just about make out the shine on this paper on the camera. There's not a lot there, I know. Now, looking at the first colour, yeah, that's lifting off really well. And so far, everything seems to be working quite well, to be honest with you. I had my reservations to begin with. I didn't think the paint would lift off. But looking at this, they lift off really, really well. And that's also using my dedicated lifting off brush. And the paint's lifting off fine, no problem at all. So, what do I think about these paints? You know what? I know they were sent to me for free to test out. I realise that. But honestly, I quite like them, you know. I think they work really well. Yeah, they are certainly vibrant and full of colour. So well done, Paul Rubens. I think this 5th generation of your paints is very, very good. As for longevity, well, of course that will depend over time. The same will apply to their paper as well. Well, now you've seen me paint a bird really quickly on here, how about watching me paint another bird in real time? I'll tell you what, I'll put a link to the top right hand corner for you. I'll see you there.